I want to start this discussion about Jews of color and the experience of Jews of color by showing you the pictures of two people who have one Jewish parent and one not Jewish parent. And we'll ask you to think which one of them would have a harder time getting accepted in a Jewish community. So the first one is of an actor. His name is Adam Goldberg. You can see his face. You've probably seen him in many movies or on TV shows, and you see his name, Adam Goldberg. The second one is a woman named Rashida Jones. You've probably seen her on TV shows, movies, and other media sources. As I said, both of them have one Jewish parent and one not Jewish parent. Which one would you imagine has a harder time getting accepted? Well, the irony is that Adam Goldberg, with that very Jewish name and that very Jewish punim, that very Jewish face, his mother is the one who's not Jewish. So in a conservative or Orthodox setting, he would not be accepted as Jewish because they only rely on matrilineal or mother-based descent. The second was Rashida Jones, as I mentioned. She's the daughter of Quincy Jones and a Jewish mother. And so her fame comes from her father's jazz music, but her Jewishness comes from her mother in the traditional definition. So she would be able to be a member of any synagogue anywhere in the world because her mother is Jewish. But the other challenge that Rashida would face, of course, is that because her father is Black, she comes with more pigmentation in her skin. And so even if you had never seen her face before, you might have said to yourself in your heart of hearts, she doesn't look Jewish. We'll talk about the problematics of that concept of looking Jewish as we go through the evening. The challenge of talking about Jews of color is it's a conceptual leap for some people because they have to get used to the idea that you can be Jewish and not simply Jewish or. For many people, Jewishness is either or. I'm Jewish or Italian. I'm Jewish or Asian. I'm Jewish or some other ethnic or cultural group. It's one or the other. And for those who have Jewish parents on both sides who have very boring 23andMe or Ancestry.com, survey results or DNA swab results, when there's just 100% Ashkenazi Jewish on both sides, that made sense to them. But in today's world, we really have to understand being Jewish as a question of being Jewish and that's true for everybody, by the way. Because I'm Jewish and accepted as white by society. I'm Jewish and male. I'm Jewish and straight. I'm Jewish and cisgendered. I'm Jewish and college educated. These are all parts of who I am, and they influence each other. My approach to Jewish life is different because I'm college educated and male and married and have children. If you're Jewish and don't have children, you may have a different approach to Judaism than if you do. So it's okay generally for people to understand being Jewish and in different categories. So my gender and my Judaism are different categories. They're not mutually exclusive. You could be Jewish by religion and a fan of the Chicago Cubs. And I might be Jewish by religion and a fan of the Detroit Tigers. And there's no conflict there because these are different categories: sports fandom and religious or cultural identity. I could even be Jewish by ethnicity and a humanist by my personal beliefs. So I celebrate Jewish culture, but I do so in a way that's consistent with a person-focused, this world, natural world-focused philosophy, as we do here at Kol Hadash. But the harder thing for people to grasp is that maybe you can be Jewish and in the same category at the same time. Maybe you're connected to two religious traditions simultaneously because your family, your parents come from two religious backgrounds. Maybe you participate in two ethnicities at the same time because your family comes with two ethnic roots in their family trees. Maybe you can be Jewish and Native American, Jewish and Jamaican, Jewish and Latino, Latina, Jewish and Latinx. Now, many people don't have a problem with biology and saying, well, I'm half this and half that because of my family tree. But some have trouble thinking beyond that to these categories of ethnicity and culture. And so let me ask you what you think about this question. And I'm hoping to talk a bit and then have some discussion as well. What is the reality in your experience? Can you be multiple ethnicities, Jewish and another ethnicity at the same time? Has that been your experience? Have you done that yourself and not just theoretical? What are your thoughts on that question of being Jewish and another group that's sort of mutually overlapping with being Jewish? Yeah, Larry, go ahead.
I think here's a point where we have to do something we don't usually do and break into two categories: religion as a cultural heritage and religion as a religious belief. Someone cannot believe the traditional Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible at the same time. They disagree. So it doesn't make sense to talk about it in that category. In terms of cultural and ethnicity, I think what you're saying makes perfect sense. But I think we've got to separate the two categories, even though we don't usually do that.
Well, I think it's also understanding religion in a more complex way. You know, it's very Protestant to think about religion purely as what you believe, but it could also be dietary practices, ritual practices, what holidays you celebrate. And I can imagine someone who is religiously Jewish and celebrates Shabbat and might also go to Easter services and Christmas services at a Catholic church because they have family heritage on both sides, and they may participate in both religions. What they believe in their mind, that's one category, but anyways, being religious is more than simply a question of you know, what you think about things. Yeah, David, please.
I had a student many years ago who was from a highly conservative Jewish family, had her bar mitzvah, she saw herself, went to Jewish summer camp, was an extremely Jewish student, a person. She got to college. She found that the Jewish community on the campus completely rejected her because she was adopted from China. So she presented, and she's Asian, but her entire life she was Jewish, and she arrived at the Hillel, and they were very cold to her, and they did not. She assumed that's who she would hang out with. She ended up, her initial friendship group were Asian students who accepted her warmly with whatever beliefs and practices she chose. She was keeping kosher. But the Jewish community on the campus turned their backs on her. And I thought that was a real shame.
That's right. Yeah, Peggy.
I converted 65 years ago. I found it very difficult the first 10 years. We still celebrated Easter because my mother, brother, and sister, they all lived up here. So we did that. And amazingly, when my son made his confirmation, he had missed 2 days. And they wouldn't let him graduate with the class because he had told them that he celebrated Easter with his grandma. I found it very difficult. First of all, I made the mistake of starting in a very conservative temple. And then I kept moving away. And for a while, I was completely away till I met Bill. And so this has been a very different from either of the places where I started and transfers.
Right. So we do take a very different approach. And for some people, it's a breath of fresh air. And for some people, it feels a little odd. But I think that it's much in keeping with the circumstances in which we find ourselves, where you have people who are experiencing multiple identities, who may identify as Jewish and Black, Jewish and Asian, because it's who they are, by lived experience, by family connection, by emotional attachment, by belief, and so on. And so this is really an important part of our experience, and it's part of our messaging. But I have to say that sometimes we ourselves in the ethnic Jewish community have real problems because we're surprised to hear about the challenges that Jews of color may face. And some of that has to do with realizing that the whole question of calling Jews of color is intimately connected to the question of whether Jews themselves are white. In some ways, using that category of Jews of color implicitly assumes that by default, not all Jews are people of color, okay? Because that whole category of people of color, of race, of being non-white, of being white, this is an American concept that is in many ways artificial. There's no strong biological basis to these lines. In fact, I found out recently, helping my daughter study for her American history test, that Mr. Plessy of Plessy versus Ferguson, the case that justified separate but equal accommodations, was himself what was called an octoroon. He was 1/8 black and 7/8 white. But in New Orleans at the time, that was enough to make him have to sit in the back of the streetcar. And that's where the case came from, that ultimately they tried to challenge that law, and ultimately it reestablished it even worse. But this is someone who presented as white, but his papers said he was black because he was 1/8. So the reality is that this question of white and black is an American concept, but the question is whether Jews count in that category. And there are times when you get into these conversations, or you start talking about racial privilege or white privilege, where Jewish people start to bring up anti-Semitism, they bring up Jewish persecution, they bring up the Holocaust. We saw this whole brouhaha with Rupi Goldberg just this week about whether the Holocaust is about race or not. And the challenge is that in America, white generally is either a visual category or a sense of being of European origin. And while at one time it was exclusive to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and Irish and Italians were not even accepted as fully white, by the 20th century, and certainly by after World War II, not only were the Irish and Italians accepted as white or white enough for this black and white categorization, but even Jews began to be accepted as white as well. And in many cases, they took conscious steps to become more acceptable to white America. There are a number of books about this that describe not only how they fought for legal recognition of the right to buy houses wherever they wanted to, and the right to go to whatever colleges and have whatever professions they wanted to, but also the process of suburbanization, the process of Jewish integration into American culture and assimilation. They didn't maintain their own ethnic ghettos with separate language that they would keep themselves segregated. They wanted their children to learn English. As Brown points out, many of them changed their names, sometimes even changed their noses, changed their pedigrees to become more part of America. They went from Cone to Kane, or some other version that sounded similar but was different enough, or from Kantrowitz to K-A-Y-E. It's a very common story, not only in Hollywood, but all over the country. And this was part of that integration into whiteness. And I'll give one other example of this, and then open up for some comments. The GI Bill, which is often presented as a wonderful example of helping the middle class rise, was generally restricted to white Americans. You weren't allowed to use these scholarships of the GI Bill in historically black colleges. And in many parts of the country, African Americans could only attend these historically black colleges. By the way, some of you may know or may not know that a number of those schools have received bomb threats in the last week or so, and we certainly need to be aware of this threat going on beyond our own borders as we think of Jewish borders. But as we'll see, Jewish borders include people who attend historically black universities because there are black Jews too. So the end result of this is that after time, Jews began to identify as white and began to be identified by society as white. They could finally get into those country clubs. They could go to those universities. They could get hired by those law firms. They could marry in to the other white populations much earlier than interracial marriage became more acceptable in American life. And most importantly, when they dealt with the power structures of society, whether it's getting a mortgage or dealing with the police, Jews have seen a positive benefit to working within the system, trusting the criminal justice system, and trusting the police to police the criminals. And this is why it's so important to understand this concept of Jewish whiteness or not. So I did want to open this up to comments or thoughts about that question of whether Jews of Ashkenazi background, Jews of European background, are indeed white or something else, some other complicated version of that. And while someone else is talking, I'll go back to the comments, which I can't read and talk at the same time. So Peggy and Bill, I know, had their hand up.
I just wanted to say that I'm not sure where Jews accepted to be hyphenated Americans. That's the only concept that I find incongruous here, is that they allow it to happen and it continues, whether in the press or in common. This guy is this hyphenated Jewish American, while no other religion is hyphenated.
My name is Jenny Myruri. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. I just wanted to offer that I think there's a lot more diversity than folks might be aware of in the Jewish diaspora. And there are many, as we're saying nowadays, of color, people of color who are Jewish in through their family and through their community and through their nation.
We're going to be talking about it as we go along, for sure. I just can't say everything all at once.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was just the diversity it was just bringing up the
Right. Well, I mean, part of our
Jewish diversity.
Right, exactly. I mean, if you go across the Jewish world, you see Jews from Ethiopia, Jews from Yemen, and they don't look like Jews from Poland. And by the way, it's not because of the air or the food. It's because they married local people, right? We know that intermarriage is not just a new phenomenon. There's been ethnic mixing all throughout Jewish life. I'll also highlight a comment that Taryn makes in the chat. They're in the car, so it doesn't work to necessarily talk. But she's also pointing out that there are plenty of what are called Jewish adjacent people, or partners of Jewish people, who are exploring Jewish communities too. And her partner, Adrian, is a brown Chicano man who was raised Catholic, but is interested in a more humanistic approach to life. And it's important to have synagogues that talk about these kind of topics and highlight the fact that we have our own racial biases and limitations that we need to be aware of. And we'll talk a little bit about why this Jews of color topic has become such an important one lately in Jewish life. I see Mom's iPad, whoever that is, maybe introduce yourself a little bit too, has something to add.
Hi everyone, my name is Heather. I'm actually a Jew of color, and I'm on my mom's iPad right now, so I was too lazy to change the name, if I'm honest. I think the typical view that people imagine a Jewish person.
I'm sorry, can you talk a little closer to the microphone? It's so hard to hear you.
All right, hello? All right. So I think the typical view that someone sees of a Jewish person is a lighter skin, more European of descent, looking person. I think that in American life, I do think Jewish people in general experience situational whiteness, in the sense that there are some people who still do get very angry or feel kind of I don't want to say betrayed, but negatively surprised if someone turns out to be Jewish that they weren't expecting it from. And I think that it kind of shows that it's the average Jewish person is accepted, but only so far. And I especially think too of Jewish communities that are more obviously Jewish, the Orthodox actually wear kippah, or Hasidim, who people always see as very obvious and they're out and about. I think they really can tell you when someone can actually assume your Jewishness, how the world treats them differently. So overall, to the question of the whiteness thing, I agree with you that it's a very American concept. And I also think that it is so situational because it's everything's fine and dandy, until, and I still think a lot of modern Jews who still experience many until moments, until you need a holiday off, until it's Shabbat, until you have to go, until someone asks you about kosher, why you can or can't do a certain thing or eat a certain thing. So those are my thoughts, and thank you for hosting this talk.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. I know some people that have experimented putting on a kippah, putting on a yarmulke to be visibly Jewish in public and seeing how things are different for their experience. And in a small way, but not the same way, you have to realize that for people of color, they can't put on or take off their minority status, right? Where Jews can, at least non-Orthodox Jews can, because we feel free to make those choices. And I saw a phrase online recently that gave me both a laugh and an insight. It said that Jews are Schrodinger's white. So this relates to the joke or the story of Schrodinger's cat, where there's a cat in a box and you don't know if the cat is alive or dead till you open the box. It could be both. So Jews are Schrodinger's white. They are white in certain circumstances, or they're not white in other circumstances. And as was pointed out by Mom's iPad, it can be revoked by somebody sort of pushing back on them or pushing them out. And the other thing I wanted to highlight, and then the last couple comments, is the problems of Jews denying their whiteness. Because when you get into these issues, people don't want to be labeled as white because then you're the oppressor. Or you're the one taking advantage of a racist system, or you're more susceptible to being on the bad side of the ledger. And when Jews respond to this by saying, well, we're not really white, what you're doing is denying your privilege, you're denying the advantages you have and your experience. And it makes it harder for people who are people of color, who can't take off that kippah, so to speak, that kippah of oppression, to accept you as a full ally. And I heard this articulated really beautifully by a woman named Samira Mehta, who's a professor at the University of Colorado and has just received a big grant to do a massive study on Jews of color and their experience. I'm really looking forward to what she produces from that work. So we have a couple comments from Jenny and then from Brown, and then we'll go on to another aspect of this.
Hi, thanks, Rabbi. I just wondered if you could repeat your question. It just helps me. Thank you.
Sure. The question was, are Jews of Ashkenazi background white? And we've talked a little bit about conditional whiteness or Schrodinger's whiteness, or white in certain circumstances and not in other circumstances. As somebody puts in the chat, maybe not the right kind of white. Some people call it off-white. I've also thought a little bit about, it is circumstance-based. Like if I go to the beach, I'd better act like I'm white and put on sunblock because otherwise I'll be red. Okay, Brown.
Thank you. With what you were just saying, I think that possibly a lot of people, when they hear, Ashkenazi folks or a lot of Ashkenazi folks or other Sephardi, other Greek Jews, Italian Jews who are neither, those small minority of Italian Jews who are neither Sephardi or Ashkenazi, that they would be part of whiteness, right? I think a lot of people feel that that is a denial and an erasure of oppression. And one thing that I've heard from other folks who are also part of communities, so, lighter skin, Latino folks, lighter skin South Asians, lighter skin Southwest Asians, is we really need you. You can be an undercover agent. So that being able to pass it's not a denial of your identity, and it's not a denial of anyone ever treating you, like, as you said, as off-white. It's just a statement about that there are situations where you are perceived as light enough skinned to have access to not being treated with the suspicion that comes with darker skin in our cultures.
Right. We don't always get to choose how society judges us. Now, in the last few years, there's been a real growth of interest in the experiences and the needs of Jews of color. Some of that comes from the more sophisticated understanding of racism that's been produced by books and academic talks and public demonstrations and marches for justice and so on that have really come to the fore in the last several years. And many Jews who've been involved in that work have sort of looked inward and said, not only are we dealing with racism out there, but maybe we have to look inside ourselves and deal with those questions of white fragility and what kind of racial biases we ourselves have integrated and have reified in our own internal communities. But one of the major debates that came up just 2 years ago was how many Jews of color are there really? Because it really depends where you live in terms of how prevalent they are in the general population, but also how likely you are to see Jews of color in your community. I will say Kol Hadash has a very limited population of Jews of color. Part of that is that we live in a very white area. If you look at the demographics of Deerfield, Highland Park, Buffalo Grove, they're overwhelmingly white. But I also wonder if there are things that we have done or not done that have made it less comfortable for Jews of color to find us as a home community for them. So I wanted to share with you a couple of articles and statistics about how many Jews of color there really are in the United States. And this will also open up that conversation alluded to before of other varieties of Jewish identity beyond Ashkenazi that are also part of the conversation. So an article that came out in May of 2020 asked that question, how many Jews of color are there? And it was written by two demographers. It cited the fact that in a recent article about a week before, it claimed that there were 12% of American Jews who were Jews of color, and that was based on a particular survey that claimed at least 12 to 15% of American Jews are Jews of color. And they say it's true that in the San Francisco Bay Area Jewish community study, 13% were Jews of color. In the New York Jewish population study, 12% of New York Jewish households are multiracial, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all the Jews in those are Jews of color. And they said, well, that 12 to 15% estimate is substantially higher than the 6% estimate made by the Pew Research Center in 2013, and that's equal to the 7% found in the 1990 study and the 5% from the 2000 study. And the number of Jews of color appears to be relatively stable during this time period. And the idea that 12 to 15% figure would imply almost 1 in 6 of American Jews is a Jew of color. The implication here is, and that's unthinkable. And they highlight other data and see that this it may be changing slightly as intermarriage continues, that share is likely to increase. They also point out that many Jews who might identify as Hispanic are in fact Ashkenazi and less likely to be of color. So 60% of Hispanic Jews in Miami consider themselves Ashkenazi. That is, they may have been from Europe to Cuba to Florida, and then and so they might still have an Ashkenazi background. A similar argument can be made against assuming all Sephardi and Mizrahi or Middle Eastern Jews are Jews of color. And this is why B'chol Lashon, which is a Jewish organization advocating for Jews of color, uses the term diverse Jews and not Jews of color. So in general, this is a study that's saying it's not as big of a population as some would like to claim. It does highlight, however, the fact that there are multiple organizations working in this field to serve this population, specifically the Jewish Multiracial Network, the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative, Jews in All Hues, we'll hear from someone from there in a little bit, and B'chol Lashon, which is still very active today, and the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism has done some work in this area. So what they're doing here is saying, well, we really don't think there are that many. Now, another study was done in the year 2020 by the Pew Forum, which is sort of the gold standard for demographic studies. And they had a whole section in this study, which they didn't have in the previous one, on race, ethnicity, heritage, and immigration among US Jews. And you'll notice here, if you look at their top line statistics, I'll zoom in a bit so it's a little bit easier to see. Most American Jews identify as white, non-Hispanic. So they broke it out by white and other identities. Of all Jews, that's the net Jewish column, 92% defined as white. And again, that 8% altogether comes as either white and something else or simply non-white. So some are white and black, some are white and Asian, some are Hispanic and white. And you see, part of the challenge with these questions is that how you identify becomes a proxy for who are your parents. That is, if you have a white and a black parent, you might identify as white and black because you don't want to pick one parent. So this is why these surveys are so complicated. But you notice there's a much higher population of Hispanic Jews than of other groups separately, but altogether 8%. So that's sort of in the middle between that 6%, 5% claim and the 12 to 15% claim on the other end. Now, the survey also talked about this question of identifying as Ashkenazi, that is from Central and Eastern Europe. And overall, among American Jews, 66% identified as Ashkenazi or European background, 3% claim to have a Sephardic background from Spain or from Sephardic communities in Greece and Turkey and in the Sephardic diaspora. 1% claim to be Middle East or North Africa, Mizrahi, or some combination of those. And 17% said, I'm just Jewish. Like, I don't even know whether I'm Ashkenazi, Sephardic. I'm just Jewish. It doesn't matter what background I'm from. And sometimes those are people that convert to being Jewish because they don't want to pick an ethnic heritage. They're simply identifying Jewishly by religion in a general sense. And in other cases, it's people who simply have lost that rich and sort of intense ethnic experience and are simply identifying as Jewish of any variety. I'm going to jump down a little bit past this, and this is the next one I wanted to highlight. The amount of diversity in the Jewish population varies depending on your definition. So of the US Jews who are Hispanic, Black, Asian, or other multiple race, again, that's 8%, 6% of them also identify as white by race. So they have both of those identities. And 3%, again, is rounding up, so it's not going to add up to the full number, did not identify as white. But when you add in Sephardic or Mizrahi Jews to Hispanic, Black, Asian, or other or multiple race, now you've got 14% of the American Jewish population. And if you add Hispanic, Black, Asian, or other multiple race, plus Sephardic or Mizrahi, plus were born or had a parent born in the Americas outside the US or Canada, in Asia, except for the former Soviet Union, in the Middle East or North Africa, including Israel, or in Africa proper, then you get to 17% of the population that in theory could count as a Jew of color. So again, how you count makes a big difference. I'll also point out, by the way, they broke out the survey into Jews by religion and Jews of no religion, or people who are cultural Jews. And you'll notice those numbers are higher among Jews of no religion. And that was the case above as well, that the Jews of no religion were more likely to be Jews of color. Again, 10% of that population compared to 8% of the overall population. And the reason why this is vitally important for the Jewish future is the next box. Younger Jews are more racially and ethnically diverse than older Jews. So again, of the overall American Jewish population, 8% were Hispanic, Black, Asian, another race, or multiracial. But of those age 18 to 29, 15% were. And if you use the broader definition, including people with a parent born elsewhere or having that background, now you're at 28% of the 18 to 29 cohort that could identify or could be identified as a Jew of color. Now, how Jews of color become Jews of color is basically 4 different routes. For some, they are the children of intermarriage. They have one parent who's Jewish and one parent who's not Jewish. For some, they convert to being Jewish. They join the Jewish family, they become religiously Jewish in any of the denominations, and that's how they begin to identify as Jewish. For some, they were adopted, as the story that David told, into Jewish families, whatever their ethnic, biological heritage is. And for some, they've been Jews for a long time in their family tree. There's a community of Black Hebrews, both in Chicago and in New York, that has some complex issues vis-a-vis the organized Jewish community and Ashkenazi Jews, but they still have identified as Jewish, and there are varying attitudes along that spectrum. The rabbi in Chicago, for example, Capers Funia, is very active in the organized Jewish community as well. It's not a hostile relationship at all. But you also have Ethiopian Jews, you have Jews in Yemen, and so on. So these are not people who are new Jews. They've been Jews for a long time, and they are people of color, and so they count in this category too. And when a survey dove into the actual population of this group, and I did see a hand up, I'll come back in just a minute. In 2021, there was a study done called Beyond the Numbers that tried to break down those categories. They found that of Jews of color, 20% identified as Black, 10% identified as Hispanic, and 10% identified as Asian. So those were the largest single groupings. 2/3 of the Jews of color they were talking to were raised Jewish, and about 40% converted to being Jewish. So that's the breakdown, that most Jews of color you're likely to meet, 2/3 of them were raised as Jews. And it's not the case that they recently joined. And so asking them, when did you convert, is particularly insulting, because why are you asking them and not the other white people who are coming into the room? Because you're assuming that they had that experience when in many cases they were raised as Jews, whether at home in a family setting or even in a synagogue setting. So I saw that Mom's iPad had her hand up. I didn't know if that person wants to jump in again.
I think part of how the percentages were swaying with based off each iteration is I know a lot of people may technically be something, like, for example, like I'm Black and white, and my children can still, by American definitions, claim that they're Black, even if they do come out, depending on who I partner with, depending on how they look. So I think the numbers swaying, part of it is how people see the world sees them
Mhm.
versus how on paper what they are, like the 23andMe stuff and that type of stuff. For example, like I went to college with someone who was like half Iraqi and like half Ashkenaz, like that was like someone in my hello group. And I don't know whether or not she like identified as a Jew or color or not, but I was like surprised to hear about the Iraqi part because she like never mentioned it before. She had like a very like typical like anglicized like name, and so I think there's that like self-perception versus like world experience.
Sure.
That was a part of it. So that's all I had to say. And my name is Heather, by the way.
Thank you, Heather.
I'm on my mom's iPad,
I got
and I
you.
was too lazy to change the name.
Well,
You
I
know
can do
how it
that
goes.
for you. Done.
It's
Okay.
Shabbat. I'm feeling very lazy, so thank you.
Great. So what I wanted to do now is I have a recording of a program with a person named Jared Jackson, who is the director of Jews in All Hues, HUES. He spoke at a conference we held at the Northwestern University in 2012. This was under the auspices of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. And we had a panel discussion on the heirs of intermarriage, children of intermarriage, adult children of intermarriage, and talking about their experiences. And he in particular was talking about his experience both as being a child of intermarriage, but also as being a child of a white Ashkenazi parent and a black not Jewish parent. And so what I'm going to do now is play for you a selection of his comments from that program. It's about 10 minutes long. And when we come back, I want to ask you a couple of questions about his presentation. First, how common do you think these experiences might still be today that he's talking about in this video clip?
Hi, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. My name is Jared Jackson. I was born in Philadelphia in the early part of the 80s. And I was born into a section that was pretty integrated. But then my family moved to New Jersey. So I grew up going to Quaker school and going to public school and having a lot of experiences both in the Jewish community and in the African American community, which were equally negative. Well, just one thing, I tried to go to Hebrew school. My family, my father died when I was just about 3. So my mom had to struggle on her own to get us any type of Jewish education. So we entered into Hebrew school, and my mom's scraping together what little money that she could. And found out almost at the end of the year of my Hebrew school experience that the rabbi's son came over to my sister and said, "Oh, well, my dad doesn't want you here." If anyone doesn't know what this means, it's a word that starts with an N. And so we found out that he wasn't the only one who had that sentiment in the congregation. And instead of my mom forcing us into a situation where we would be completely scrutinized over a period of time, we left and didn't really feel safe in Jewish community. That happened, like, I think I was around 7 or 8. I didn't step foot into a synagogue or a Jewish space until I was 21. And my story is, yes, it's unique, it's my story, but there are a lot of people who share the same story. And on the other side of things, living in the town that I lived in, there were a lot of people who would try to evangelize and convert my mom in the supermarket or at her office in a public school. And so there was a feeling of being unsafe as a Jew in the town that I lived, but unsafe as an African American in the Jewish community that was near. So basically, we did rituals. We did Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and Passover Seder at home. Some people ask me like, "Well, you were in a part of a synagogue. So you had nothing." That's not true. I had my sisters. I had my mom. I even had a bubby. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it's Yiddish for grandmother. Throughout my life, I've really connected with other people who shared what I call, or my organization, Jews and All Accused, calls dual heritage. Somebody who has non-Jewish heritage and Jewish heritage, whatever the mixes may be on either end. And even though I really thank Birthright Israel Next and Birthright Israel for the time that I spent with those two organizations, but I really found that for me, there was still something lacking. You know, I was connecting with other dual heritage Jews, but I wasn't connecting with them in a way that was really on the deeper level, other than, oh, you have one non-Jewish parent. Me too. Great. Let's do Kiddush. You know, there wasn't a space to talk about the deeper issues, the deeper celebration of dual heritage. So in 2009, I started this organization, Jews and All Hues, and we do programming for people who have one non-Jewish parent, or they're an adoptee, or they're Jew by choice, or in some cases, they're the child of. Adult children is kind of a, I don't know, it seems like an oxymoron, but I guess with me and the rest of the millennials, maybe that's a fitting term. But I created this in order to celebrate dual heritage, in order to bring about change in the world, because there are gateways, there are people who are self-proclaimed gatekeepers. We've been talking a lot about the statistics and what happens, like when you're sitting in an office and like crunching numbers and all, and not really what's happening on the ground. My work is about what's happening on the ground, what people are experiencing, the negative things and the positive things that they're experiencing in Jewish community. Whether that's being asked, oh, so are you really Jewish? You don't look Jewish. Which you may laugh at that, but to somebody, even though you may think it's something slight, something that you say every day, oh, this person doesn't look Jewish. Oh, they'll probably find a husband or a wife sooner than somebody who, quote unquote, looks Jewish, or other comments like that. But to somebody who has dual heritage, it might be a wall that gets put up where they don't feel safe in that environment. Where if you go to a synagogue and you walk in, you have the person at the door that greets you. And if they ask you, so why are you here? And it's the tone of the voice, and also their body language and all. Like, if somebody asks you, why are you here, before you're actually there, it causes a problem. You know, Miriam wanted us to talk about basically the opposite of what we talked about, either being welcomed or being unwelcome. So I will talk about being welcome. So I, when I was running programming at a university that I went to, like at the time the group was known as the Hillel group on campus, and then it became the Jewish Student Union because somebody forgot to fill out the proper paperwork. Anyway, so there was a small congregation that was actually labeled unaffiliated. or I'm sorry, uncategorized by the Jewish Federation because it had so many people from different streams. And it was the only synagogue within, well, a mile radius of the university. And beyond that, the next one was like 10 miles down the road. So I went there for high holiday services, not knowing anyone, but speaking to the rabbi beforehand, saying, hey, I'm bringing a bunch of students. Obviously, they're like, oh, students, yeah, come on in. But I went in there, and the first question somebody asked me was, hey, would you like an aliyah? I mean, like, we're just, giving them out today. You look like you're cool. And then I walked in, and as I walked in, I was like, looking over my shoulder, like, isn't somebody gonna ask me any questions or something? Like, not anything like completely stupid, like pull down your pants and show me you're Jewish. But like just like the regular questions that I was used to hearing, like, oh, so is your mother Jewish? Or, kind of talking in that soft NPR voice. I found myself like feeling a little bit awkward because I wasn't feeling awkward. And somebody let me sit down, grab a siddur, and like just go along with everybody else and be part of the community. And then people just ask me, hey, you're hungry, you want to come back to my place? It was just very inviting, welcoming, letting me be who I am in the space like that I'm trying to be in. And that was like that's still one of my favorite welcoming experiences.
So what did you think about Jared's stories about his experience? Any reactions to what he had to say, or any thoughts about how prevalent that might be today? I mean, as a rabbi, it kills me, that somebody wants to be there and people are pushing them away. They appoint themselves as like the ethnic bouncers who get to kick people out whose pedigree isn't high enough, and it's really appalling. And it's like that Groucho Marx joke about how the food is bad and there's not enough portions. We can't complain that there aren't a lot of Jews and then kick people out. If we want more Jews, we need to let them in. Yeah, Peggy, go ahead.
I had that experience. I went to Hillel when I first moved to this neighborhood because I didn't belong to a temple. And the treatment I got there was atrocious. I mean, I really wanted to write to them after I was finished. First of all, it was like 4 hours for a holiday. And they said, you don't look Jewish, why are you here? But not looking Jewish, you can't believe how many derogatory statements I hear. I worked in Kenilworth. How many derogatory statements I heard just not looking Jewish.
Right.
So
it goes both ways.
It works both ways.
And actually, Jared himself was involved recently when there was an issue with one of the heads in Philadelphia of the NAACP, the local chapter, shared some nasty anti-Semitic cartoons. He had been sort of sucked into that. Unfortunately, the Nation of Islam, while it promotes Black pride, also has a very anti-Semitic edge to it, Farrakhan himself as well. And what was interesting is Jared has credibility in both communities because he's active in Black life and for racial justice issues as a Black man, and he has deep connections to the Jewish community. And so he could help serve as a person with a foot in both worlds to talk to both of his communities. Sorry, Larry, were you going to jump in and add something?
Just an uncomfortable comment. I think my experience over the course of my life has been maybe not to the same extreme as other groups, but statistically, there are about as many racists and bigots in the Jewish population as in every other population in our society. And it's disappointing when we run across it, but we seem to be perpetually surprised by it. And I don't understand. Get over it. It's there. I'm not saying like it. I'm not saying accept it, but don't be surprised by it anymore. Don't pretend it's not there and get caught every time.
Right. And push back. don't let it go. Even if there's nobody of color there, our job as people who are allies is to push back against our own people who are saying the things that we don't want said and are thinking the things we don't want thought. We have a responsibility to our broader humanity, not only, and to our fellow Jews who are people of color who are going to hear this or experience that when they come in our doors.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
So let me ask you this question. Oh, sorry, someone else have something to add, please?
I'm wondering who out there is surprised. It's something I've seen my entire life because I've experienced acceptance and rejection from the Jewish community. And I've heard the Jewish community come out with the most racist, bigoted things. And I've also heard things from totally anti-Semitic from outside. And it's just a real situation that never seems to change.
Yes. Well, if anything, I think it can be seen as slightly better in that it's less acceptable in many circles than it was, let's say 50 or 80 or 100 years ago. But it's still far too acceptable in far too many places. We can put it that way. So I wanted to ask you a looking forward question. And that is, what changes do you think will occur in the Jewish community because of this increasingly visually and culturally diverse new generation of Jews? How are they going to change Jewish life? Because we saw those numbers are higher in the younger population, and intermarriage will continue. And as barriers to interracial and interethnic marriages are going down, that's only going to increase over time. Not just a white Jew marrying another white ethnic like Italian or Irish or Protestant of any variety, but now it's going to be Jews and Asians and Jews and Indians. I do plenty of weddings that they call it a Hindu wedding, where it's a Hindu person and a Jewish person, and they try to incorporate elements of both of their family cultures. But they're going to produce a whole new generation of people who hopefully are connected to being Jewish, but don't, quote, look Jewish in the way that previous generations did, at least of that Ashkenazi, majority of the American Jewish population. So what changes might happen in Jewish life? And I'll mention just a couple. One is at our last Passover program I did for the Sunday school, I shared two versions of a Seder plate. One is the more conventional Jewish religious style, and another one was created by the specialist in Southern cooking. His name is Michael Twitty. He's African-American and Jewish, and he decided to design a Seder plate that reflected the African-American culinary experience. And so the choice of what he used for bitter herbs and what he used for charoset and what he used for the greens was really fascinating. But it was trying to harmonize his Jewishness and his African-American cultural identity. There's also a Facebook post, a Facebook group page that's run by our executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, Paul Golan. His wife is Japanese. His children are both and are being exposed and experiencing both. And so he runs a Facebook page called Jewanese, which is about the intersection of Jewishness and Japanese identity. And there's a book called JewAsian about that fusion by a couple who themselves, one was born Jewish, the other partner was born Asian by ethnic background, converted to Judaism, but are again raising their kids in the Pacific Northwest, exposed and experiencing both cultures, both by visual identity as people will identify them from outside, but also in their own family life. And the last example I'll mention is a rabbi who was in the news recently. You might have heard that when the hostage taking took place in Texas, the hostage taker insisted on talking to a rabbi in New York City. And the rabbi's name was Angela Buchdahl. And he figures since she's the rabbi at Central Synagogue, she's the rabbi in charge of the whole country that I have to talk to so that she can get this prisoner released from the Fort Worth federal prison. Again, this is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. But the rabbi he insisted on talking to is named Angela Buchdahl. She's the head rabbi of Central Synagogue in New York. And she herself is of Korean and Jewish background. Her mother is Korean, of Korean ethnic background. Her father is of Ashkenazi Jewish background. She herself went through a conversion process because she wanted to be more broadly acceptable. She's actually both a rabbi and a cantor. You want to talk about double education, she really got it. And she happens to be the sister-in-law of one of my friends from college. So I've been aware of her for a long time. But when you look at her, she doesn't, quote, look Jewish in that old way, but she's the rabbi of one of the largest synagogues in the world. In fact, Jared Jackson himself married a woman named Rebecca Pierce, who is a Reform rabbi, also mixed white Jewish and Black heritage. And they're a very Jewish family. I mean, they're both working in the Jewish nonprofit world. In fact, she's part of a program that's coming up later this month called "This is What Jewish Looks Like," because it's not what you thought it was. Any other thoughts on what changes might happen when the rabbi looks different, when the Seder plate looks different, when the population in the congregational pews looks different, when the people you're serving to marry them looks different? What kind of changes do you think will happen in organized Jewish life?
Rabbi, perhaps the changes will come like Reform, modern Orthodox, and so on have changed. Society changes, demographics change, people's attitudes change. Will there be, could perhaps, I'm trying to think of an example that I have a former student named Jeremy Blaustein, lives in Himeji, Japan, married to a Japanese woman, raising his kids Jewish in Japan, in a small town. Very well accepted. The kids are both whatever his wife is. She hasn't converted, but he's raising them with Jewish values too. And it's very interesting. Will we have a homogenous Jewish society? I don't think so. I think we'll have many different branches. I think we'll move on from the traditions that we know to new traditions.
Mm-hmm. I see Brown and then Peggy and Bill.
I just think it sounds like it's going to be a lot better in the future.
Maybe better. Okay, Brown.
I attended a conference of Celtic Language University educators of North America, so Irish, Scottish, and many of the speakers, they would just throw Irish words into their presentation. And some of the Scottish speakers in the room were ready to turn tables over and run out of the room. So one hope that I would have for the future is that we could have a broader community consciousness of my Jewish is not your Jewish. And I really liked the presenter at the conference did something very casually in that he provided a Yiddish translation. So the non-assumption of Ashkenazi as default, if you make an Ashkenazi or Yiddish reference, even if you make a Hebrew reference, like I said, your Jewish is not my Jewish. Not everybody has had the same experience with their Jewish life and may not have been exposed or remember. So being inclusive when we make those references.
There's actually a phrase people use today. You want to avoid being Ashkenormative. Sort of like heteronormative, where you're assuming everyone's a male and a female partner. You don't want to necessarily be Ashkenormative and assume everybody has kugel as Jewish food. You know, there are different Jewish foods for different parts of the Jewish world. I mean, some other open questions, I don't have the answers to this, but it may be that in some circles, Jewishness will become emphasized more as a religion, because then it's easier for people with different ethnic identities to connect with Jewish religion. They convert religiously, they connect with Jewish religious ideas and as a belief system. And so that the ethnic part of the Jewish cultural ethno-religion, whatever it is that we're experiencing and have experienced for centuries, that's going to shift. And maybe it'll shift toward more on the religious side for some people, and less in the sort of family, ethnicity, heritage, heirlooms experience. It may also be that for those who do maintain a more secular lifestyle and still want to connect with Jewish heritage in some way, that they'll get a more sophisticated understanding of what it's like to be personally multicultural. Not just a multicultural society with separate silos for all the different groups, but individuals who have roots in multiple silos and who feel connected to many cultures around the world and are celebrating part of themselves at any one time, but are bringing all of themselves to whatever they're doing. So they're not that other identity when they're lighting a Hanukkah menorah. In fact, they might want to bring those together and choose a color scheme for their menorah that reflects both of their cultural heritages. We've done this for many years in Humanistic Judaism when students are choosing what they want to focus on for their bar and bat mitzvahs. Many of them who are from multiple heritages choose something that connects to both of them. So they might have a story about the Jews of Ireland, or we had one student who was part Armenian, and so she did her project on the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem because she was a quarter Armenian. And so it was a natural fit. And, you know, similarly for other ethnic and cultural backgrounds, there's no reason why you can't talk about the intersection in Jewish life of this experience because it intersects in your life. So I see William or Sandra's hand is up.
Hey, it's William. Another thing you might see is like two rough factions of one, a Jewish community that embraces diversity and maintains Jewish heritage, and the other one is more puritanical, insisting on on exact codes for who is a Jewish, very strict. So I hope I don't see that future, but that's possible.
Yeah, for sure. There was a comment in the chat that maybe it'll change when the critical mass is reached and the faces just look so different you can't ignore it anymore. You know, just like with intermarried families now in many Reform congregations now, they're becoming a sizable population. So it's untenable. There was a Reform congregation in the Chicagoland suburbs that until maybe 5 years ago, the rabbi there would not officiate at intermarriages. And then he decided one year that he was going to start doing it, and he announced it at the high holidays, and everyone was so happy to see he'd opened his mind. And I'm thinking to myself, we've been doing this for 50 years in our movement, you know, mazel tov. Slow clap, right? Great job. But it's progress for that community. I shouldn't be bitter about it. But I have to say that some of us have lived in that open Jewish life for a long time. And it may well be that there'll be a split between open Jews and more close-minded Jews. So see, Bron has a hand up again, and then David.
One thing that occurs to me is that the Jewish family has never not been changing. And so it's interesting that people picked a year or a decade or a century and remembered that as those are the way that I remember Jews looking like. And so seeing this as just a continuation of the way that it's always been.
Yeah. David?
Many years ago, maybe not so many years ago, the confirmation class would regularly visit Temple Sinai downtown. When we visited when they were still practicing that unique classical reform style of Judaism. And when we visited, we would always meet with their class that was also working on comparative religion. And as we visited over the years, but especially at our last couple visits, that class was phenomenally diverse in a way that our class wasn't. And a couple students noted that their Sunday school class, their comparative religion class, looked more like their day school class and less like our Sunday school class. And much as has just been commented in the chat, and I think Rabbi Dan had a sermon about this years and years ago, increasingly them will become us. And as we saw, you showed us with the Pew study, especially with the notation for younger people, that's coming. That'll be here, and it'll be here relatively soon. And the communities that Bron was talking about that are, William was talking about, that maybe have higher walls, may find that that's keeping them in more than it's keeping people out.
I think it will definitely change our attitude toward the world around us. After all, in the last 50 years, Jews have generally been relatively confident in the justice system, in police. Look at how many Jewish lawyers there are, how many Jewish judges there are. I mean, we're well invested in the system, in the structure. We're in professions and in circumstances that assume a stable structure. But maybe we begin to sympathize differently when we think about the effect of having a police car outside of a building. For some, it makes them feel more safe. For others, it may make them feel less safe. And if they are us and we are them, we need to think about walking a mile in their shoes. And I'll share with you the article that started that sort of argument over how many Jews of color are there really was one that talked about the effects of COVID on Jews of color specifically. And it was just a few days before the response article that created that brouhaha about how many there really are. But the point of the article was that Jews of color feel a particular sense of isolation. And notice how smoothly the people quoted in this are living in their multiple identities. So Jordan Berg Powers says, as a Black person, I'm really worried. And he talks about health issues that he has, highlights the fact that Black Americans were almost a third of COVID deaths at the early stage of the pandemic. It illustrates how racist, misogynist, and classist this country is. Black and brown folks are told to homeschool our kid. So again, his experience as a Black person is influencing who he is, but he's also Jewish. He's quoted in this story and bringing his experience to the Jewish world. This is published in the a publication called E-Jewish Philanthropy, which is a central publishing for issues in the Jewish world online. Angelica Ruiz, a Latina Filipina Jew and director of libraries and archives at Temple Emmanuel in Dallas, Texas, says she's proud of everything Reformed Jewish congregations are doing to support one another, but she and other Jews of color are often left out. We don't live in the Jewish areas of our town and city. We've heard about people dropping off challahs and other goods, but this hasn't happened to me. I live further south than everyone else. And when we're physically separated, it hurts. I know it's unintentional, but it further complicates the relationships. It also points out that people of Asian descent being blamed for the disease, you might remember the China disease and all those kind of accusations, and the increase of harassments of Asians. And Ruiz, who herself again is Latino Filipina, says she was the target of anti-Asian verbal assault. And Becky J., an Asian Jewish rabbinical student at HUC, said she endured similar attacks on the subway, at the grocery store, walking home late at night. They knew nothing about me but the way I looked. And then she says, as a Jew, I cannot bring myself to believe this is the way God wants us to treat each other. And I cling to our values and traditions to provide even a small sense of comfort in the face of this fear. So she's living her Asian experience and bringing that to the attention of the broader Jewish community that doesn't know what it's like to live in an Asian body. And Yolanda Savage Narva talks about being a Black Jew and how that has influenced her experience, reminded her of the systemic racism and oppression and so on of these communities. So this is an example of how that us becoming them, that the lines of Jewish racial identity and whiteness are breaking down. And the reality is that these bigotries that we might think we dodged by changing our names, by moving out of urban enclaves, by learning English and forgetting Yiddish, and by presenting ourselves as white, in the end, because our doors are open to all those who want to be part of the Jewish family, we're not going to be white anymore. We're going to be who we've always been, which is a diverse world people, but now even more diverse than we've ever been in Jewish life. And so I want to end once and for all. If I could do one thing in my lifetime as a rabbi, it's to end this phrase of, you don't look Jewish. What does that mean? It means you don't look Ashkenazi. It means you don't look like what I think Jews should look like. It means I'm prejudiced in assuming what Jews should look like. And so we have to work that phrase out of our vocabulary. You don't look Jewish. This is what Jewish look like. This is what we've been talking about all day.
Just one thing is that, Jews, the Jewish people, I'm generalizing, take such pride in, the success of Jews. But for every success we have Jeffrey Epstein or a Sackler family and something else. So we're the same as everyone else, and not more and not less.
And that means we have as much work to do.
Exactly.
Yeah, Judy, please go ahead.
I found this interesting because I have two adopted grandchildren that were born in Africa. When my grandson was little, and my daughter, just out of curiosity, asked him, if somebody asks you what you are as far as religion goes, he said, well, my mother is Jewess and my father's the other one. And that was it. He didn't really think much about it. And I don't even know if to this day, Sarah's 16 and Colin is now 12, whether they've had any problems. Now they're in a mostly, I guess, white neighborhood, white schools. And I don't think they've had a problem as far as being Black and I guess they're considered Jewish. I mean, they've never even brought that up. Maybe they're too young. I don't know that they've had any problems. Sarah's friends, she got into with a bunch of kids from Stevenson that are of color, and she seems to have a lot of friends, and she never said anything about the fact that that her mother's Jewish is a problem.
Well, it's interesting to see, you know, in many ways, the kids are all right. This is their normal. This is what they're used to. In fact, Rashida Jones in an interview said that she grew up in a neighborhood. I think Maya Rudolph was in the same neighborhood, who also has Jewish ancestry. There were a lot of kids like her that were, you know, of mixed heritage, whether it's white and black or Jewish and something else. And so it didn't feel out of the ordinary at all. And so, you know, just as intermarried families are more and more popular now, or more and more prevalent now, I should say. And that's not an out of the norm experience in the liberal Jewish world. We can say the same thing for Jews of color, where in, you know, when I retire, let's say in 30 years, I'll look back on this talk and say, yeah, you know, that was a moment in time and we're well past it now. And hopefully some of you will be there with me to be able to celebrate that moment too.